Hey everyone! In this video, I'll go over the workflow I use in CLIPSTUDIO to shade a painting in what I found is the most efficient way between speed and precision. Before we start, please subscribe and press the like button. It will help me so much and is really much appreciated. Thank you everyone. Now let's get started. I don't use a line art in the final image, but you can always keep your line art if you desire. These tips are independent of that fact. First, we will need our flat color layer. Use the lasso tool to create the shapes of our subject. Here there will be just one color for the sake of simplicity, but if you most likely have multiple colors in your drawing, I like to paint them all in this layer using the lasso tool and the fill tool. Next, we will create a new layer and start painting in the shadows. The shadows should not be black, but a darker shade from the color underneath. Still, during the painting phase, I'll just select a metal or dark gray to paint in the shadows. I'll use the lasso tool to select big areas and then use the airbrush to shade the shapes globally. Before going in again with the lasso tool and adding smaller details with a darker color for dark shadows and creases, or erasing a bit of a big shadow to create bumps on the shape that will take the light. You can also use any technique to paint like you want. For example, just use hard brushes and maybe blur it out or mix it out after. Create sharp lines of shadows for sharp features and soft ones for the softer parts of your subject. For example, a cube would have the most sharp shadows, and a sphere soft ones. In the human body, everything is a bit in between these. Elbows, chin, noses, and ears, for example, and such can have hard shadows, while breast, thighs, and so on are softer. Apparent muscles create harder shadows than softer bodies. I do not use the clipping mask on this layer because it messes up the next step. So you can just select your layer with the flat color, use the Ctrl plus click on it, or a right click to add the layer to selection. Then you can use this selection to invert it and go back on the shadows layer and quickly erase everything outside of your subject on the shadows layer if you paint it roughly. You can just use the erase outside in the floating toolbar once you selected the layer. Now we will add the colors onto the shadows layer. First, make sure your shadows layer has gray tones and not black, otherwise they will not be colored. If it's black, you can lock the pixels on the layer, select a gray tone and use the bucket icon on the whole picture. Now you duplicate your base color layer, put it above the shadow layer and set it to color mode, and then use a clipping mask to affect only the shadows layer. This will keep the luminosity of your shadows how you painted them, but will quickly change all the colors based on your flat colors. If you want, you can then merge these two layers together. Next, we will be adding some color to the terminators of the shadows. This is the part where the shadows meet the highlights. You can use your airbrush and select a more saturated color of your shadows and paint over the soft part of your shadows, while ignoring the sharp shadows. You can then set this layer clipped to your shadows layer and use a blending mode such as add or color dodge or screen, and reduce opacity to your liking to make this layer subtle and not too overpowering. This will help give much life in different textures. If you add red into your shadows on flesh, for example, it will help bring out the blood from the flesh underneath and make it a much more living piece. And finally, we have our highlights. For this layer, I like to use a selection of the shadow layer and invert it, then quickly use an airbrush to paint only on the spots most touched by light. And finally, also use the selection of our color layer to invert it and erase everything outside if it's needed. When this layer is done, you can set it to a mode like Add Glow or Color Dodge Glow and lock the transparency of the layer. Now, just try picking different colors and using the fill button to see what color of light you prefer and what intensity of light. We are all done with our basic shading, but you might want to add a creative lighting setup, maybe different colors and so on. For this, there are numerous techniques, but I favor using adjustment layers for their flexibility and non-destructive ways of working. I just group all my layers and create, then clip an adjustment layer on top of the group. You can, for example, create a color balance layer and use it to push or pull different colors into the shadows, highlights, and midtones. Here, I will push cooler tones in the shadows by adding cyan, blue, and maybe a bit of green, while pushing more warm and reddish tones in the highlights. The text box Preserve Luminosity also has an impact on the global piece. I recommend trying it. The second adjustment layer I use is Curves. With this one, you can also go into different color channels and push the same tones as the color balance layer in the shadows and highlights. And when you're on the RGB curve, you can also adjust the contrast of your whole image. If you do not know how these two adjustment layers work, I recommend watching a tutorial that goes very in-depth because these are very powerful tools, and when you know how to use them, you can add almost any color and contrast to your image. And also, it's non-destructive, so you can always go back and change your mind. I find this the most efficient way of working to add the finishing touches to your image. And there you go. This is my process on how I shade images in CLIPSTUDIO. I hope this was helpful to you, and I'll see you in the next video. In the meantime, bye everyone and keep creating.